So on this day in our church year where we often decide to devote our attention to the honor of Martin Luther King and his legacy around civil rights, economic justice, and racial justice in our country, I want to start by telling you a story from our tradition where racial justice and some complicated aspects of it overlap with our churches and our ministers. In 1848, a woman named Ellen Craft, her husband William, became fugitive slaves out of Macon, Georgia. Ellen and William left together in disguise. Ellen had skin light enough that she could pass for a white person, and since a woman of the time wouldn't have been accompanied alone with a slave traveling, she disguised herself as an elderly gentleman. She cut her hair, she put on man's clothing. She couldn't write, so she put her arm in a sling so that anyone who saw her wouldn't ask her to write. She and William received a pass to visit their family at Christmas time, December 1840. And they got that, they left town, and they kept going. They got on railroads and steamships, all the while posing as a white elderly gentleman and a black slave. Eventually they make it to Boston, where they live among a freed persons community in Boston, and they join a Unitarian church led by the Reverend Theodore Parker. Some of you have heard Theodore Parker talked about from this pulpit. He's the one who wrote A Government for the People, by the People, of the People. He's the person who wrote the words, "The arc of the universe, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Those original words came from him. Now, Parker was an abolitionist and a rabid one, and a radical Unitarian at the time, so much so that some of the Boston area ministers tried to find a way to excommunicate him, but there wasn't a way to excommunicate a Unitarian at the time. But they tried. It's said that Parker preached with a Bible in one hand and a gun behind the pulpit to protect fugitive slaves in his church. We do that too. No. It's a water pistol, but now whether that story is apocryphal or not, it stands to show the passion that Parker brought to this work. So the Crafts joined this congregation. Parker, only a few months later, the Fugitive Slave Act is signed into law. The Fugitive Slave Act, which says that people who escape slavery from the South and go toward the North where black people are free can be returned as property legally back to the South. Now, this Fugitive Slave Act was signed by Millard Fillmore, a Unitarian, who said that he detested slavery but believed this was the only way for the Union to be kept intact. Now, at the time, Theodore Parker is preaching about abolition and working to assist those who are fugitive slaves. He has fugitive slaves in his congregation, the Crafts being one of them. And the Unitarian church across town, or really just down the street, did not have those views. It was led by a minister, Ezra Stiles Gannett, who preached sermons in favor of enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act. He too said that he detested slavery, but believed this act was a necessary evil to maintain the Union. And he preached sermons supporting members of his congregation, then going out and helping to find fugitive slaves and work with the bounty hunters that were looking for them to return them to the South and to slavery. So they're at a ministers' conference in 1851. And Theodore Parker gets behind the pulpit and he angrily looks at the people around him and says, "His members are trying to kidnap my members." Can you imagine this happening today? If Daniel and I got to a minister's conference and said to somebody from Fort Worth, "They're trying to kidnap the people here." This was an amazing moment in our history. Parker writes a letter to Millard Fillmore, the president, to tell him he plans on breaking the law. So in this scenario, we're a people who love to tell the stories of our bright, shining moral leaders throughout history. And we have many of them. And we should be proud of those moments. But this story is a more complicated and uncomfortable one for me because it's about black fugitive slaves who become Unitarians, working with a Unitarian minister to be protected from other Unitarians from enforcing a law signed by a Unitarian president. This is not a simple or comfortable story where we are entirely part of the solution and not part of the problem. Fast forward over 100 years later, and Martin Luther King is addressing a group of Unitarian Universalist ministers and laypersons at General Assembly, our annual conference. At this point, the Unitarian Universalist Association is only 5 years old after the merger of the Unitarian and Universalist churches. And he stands at the Ware Lecture, the main address at this conference, and delivers a sermon and a speech to them that he's delivered 1,000 times. A version of this Rhodes sermon has already been preached at SMU, at many churches across the country, at political gatherings, and really anywhere else where he would be heard. I looked and read different versions of this address over the last couple of weeks and saw how stunningly similar they were, except for a few points. I saw some notable edits that King made when he spoke to UUs. First of all, he starts out the entire address by telling them for 3 paragraphs how happy he is to be with people he doesn't feel like he has to convince. He says, "It feels good to be with people who get it. I'm glad I don't have to convince you of things that you don't believe." He tells them how he attended Unitarian churches when he was in seminary. In fact, he and Coretta Scott King considered becoming Unitarian Universalists, but they decided that they would have more influence in the Baptist tradition. She talked about that later in life. He goes on to tell them that he's felt at home in Unitarian churches, that he gave the eulogy for the Reverend James Reeb, a Unitarian who was killed at Selma. He familiarizes himself with them. And then later, the second major edit that I found interesting. There's a section where he talks, and he used this speech in a ton of other places. But in this version, he's talking in a section about the fact that some people who believe in legal equality for all people still really believe that one race is better than another. Smarter, more hardworking, all these myths about racial superiority. And then he says, "But I'm so thankful that no Unitarian Universalists believe that." First of all, even though I'm proud of our heritage, I find it hard to believe that in a gathering of any white people in 1966, there weren't people who didn't hold on to beliefs of racial superiority, or today. But I wondered why he put that in there. It was obviously on purpose. He didn't have to. He'd given that speech dozens, if not hundreds of times around the country. Why did he feel like he had to include that line? I can't get inside his head. But as a person who's attended those general assemblies and heard justice speakers address us, I wonder if he thought maybe to be heard by this group, he had to make sure their defenses were down, to reduce a little of their guilt or discomfort, or to tell them, "Don't worry, you're not part of the problem. You're just part of the solution." Now, in 2014, I am one of those UUs that he would be addressing if he showed up today at one of our conferences. And I have to admit to you that I have a deep desire in me to hear people that I really respect tell me that I'm not part of the problem. It is uncomfortable to believe anything else. But I know otherwise. It's uncomfortable for me to know that my life is easier and more privileged, and I have legal access to equality under the law and am not seen as a criminal by law enforcement, and a million other privileges simply by walking around in this human body. I am white, straight, male, middle class, able-bodied, educated, every single category of privilege right now that I can identify. I inhabit. Simply by walking around in this skin. It is uncomfortable for me to admit how easy it is for me to say words about justice and equality and have little risk for doing so. Aside from saying something the wrong way and having someone become upset from time to time. I can stand in this pulpit and talk about racial justice and economic equality in a congregation that resides in one of the top 10 wealthiest neighborhoods in the United States. And then I can go to my house, situated in a solidly middle-class neighborhood next to beautiful landmarks and nature, a neighborhood I chose because it was safe and had a good elementary school and I could afford it with the salary that you provide me. And I don't have to worry that someone's going to call me on my hypocrisy about my words of justice and equality because the people that live on my street look like I do. It's very comfortable. And I hope that if Martin Luther King were standing here in our pulpit today instead of me, he would not seek to relieve us of our discomfort. I do not believe that he could have possibly lived through the last couple of years in America and stood in this pulpit and said, everything's fine now. Because our discussions of race and justice and poverty are not over by any stretch of the imagination. Remember that when Martin Luther King was killed in 1968, his approval rating was plummeting among whites and blacks. He had gone on to make the connection between racism, militarism, and poverty, saying that all of those were deeply interrelated in American culture, and that message did not go over well, still doesn't. And so I wonder if he were with us over the last couple of years. I doubt he could have not noticed 2013 being the year of the trial concerning the death of Trayvon Martin, with painful discussions of race and justice in our country. Surely he would have noticed a new pope taking the world by storm by simply saying he loves poor people and being called a Marxist by some critics, mostly American critics, because the Pope has gone on to say that we should not just love the poor, but build a world in which they're not poor anymore. The stock market in the United States has the best year it's had in over 15 years, bringing record amounts of wealth to individuals, and the gap between the rich and poor in our country is the biggest it's been since the age of the Rockefellers. In 2012, a federal court of 3 judges ruled that Texas voter ID laws and redistricting were, quote, enacted with discriminatory purpose related to race. Only a few months ago, the Supreme Court of the United States overturned parts of the Voting Rights Act, and those laws, which were, quote, enacted with discriminatory purpose, are for now back on the books. Now, these laws do not say anything explicitly about black people having a harder time voting. But these laws have been found through many studies to disproportionately affect women, the poor, and people of color. We finished 2013 with 2 of the biggest news cycles, whether they were manufactured or stupid, being a nationwide discussion about whether a white millionaire who makes his money selling duck calls believes that black people were happier before pre-Jim Crow America, or whether gays and lesbians deserve equality under the law. And then a national debate about whether Santa Claus and Jesus were historically white. As if the ethnic background of a Middle Eastern Jew 2,000 years ago was in question. We're not done talking race and poverty or war. Remember that there are young people graduating from our church from high school this year, going to college, who literally cannot remember a time when we were not at war. It's hard to talk about these things, and it should be. It should be uncomfortable. King called for what he called creative maladjustment in those words that you heard this morning. A new society to help people become creatively maladjusted. And I like that in this year of creativity, the idea that there's something wholly good that we can do with being upset. He said, if you live in a world or a society in a city where these gross injustices occur, you should not be comfortable. And I looked at some of his theology this week, and I think it's valid for us. First thing I noticed is that King's God makes use of uncomfortable, maladjusted people. That's good for us. King's God makes use of people no matter how poor they are or how rich they are, no matter how sick or well, no matter how powerful or oppressed. King's God makes use of people with a criminal record. King lists all these people that he praises. Gandhi, who uses the poor of the poor to break laws to change the world, and Henry David Thoreau, who broke the law to change the world, and Jesus, who was killed as an enemy of the state. And King's own mugshot is pretty good. King's God says that if your heart breaks when thinking about these things, that's great. It means you are awake and alive, that you have a vibrant, beating heart and a strong spirit that shudders when it gets close to injustice. King's God is also concerned with concrete change in the here and now. Now, granted, I may be seeing what I want to see in his sermons that I was reading, but I did not see a lot of talk about how great things are going to be when we get to heaven. I saw talk about right now. I didn't see King preaching much about how loving Jesus would save an individual soul from hell. I saw a lot about how we are called as brothers and sisters to build a beloved community right now before we die, because there's likely no other time. This is a concrete God who cannot separate religion and politics, no matter how badly churches and state have tried to pretend they're separate sometimes. This is a God that is concerned with very specific lunch counters, and very specific buses, and very specific politicians, and very specific acts of legislation. This is not an abstract God. And if I may say so, I think that King's God is a universalist. Maybe just with a small u, but a universalist nonetheless. King is marching alongside Presbyterians and Baptists and Jews and atheists and Unitarian Universalists and anyone of goodwill who will build a more fair world. He says over and over again, we're all in this together. Those are the last lines of those words that we read this morning, where he says our fates are intricately tied with one another. That if people in North Dallas are better off, but people in South Dallas are poorer next year, nobody is better off. That we are either building heaven on earth or building hell on earth, but we're all going there. And then I read Adrian Rich's poem about a people who, in a dense fog, as history passed them by, clutched to the word I. Not a universalist thing to do. I look out into this congregation and I know that we have homeless people and millionaires. We have people who are documented and people who are not. This congregation includes gay and straight Democrats and Republicans, but I hope the one thing we share is that we will settle for nothing less than a robust theology of we that is not satisfied until we, not someone else, are agents of building heaven on earth. If you are made uncomfortable and don't know what to do because there is increasing poverty in our society, I'm happy because we have room for your discomfort. If the number of people who go hungry or without homes in our city or without adequate health care in our city makes you hurt, good. You are alive, and your heart beats and knows injustice when it sees it. If the neighborhoods in the city of Dallas, segregated by money and race, make you yearn to build a city in which we have more access to one another, good. Your vibrant heart bends the arc of the moral universe toward justice. Because, my friends, our history of racial and social justice is not history. This is not us looking back with some arrow only toward the past, praising the efforts of Unitarians in the 1860s or the 1960s. I trust and hope, I deeply hope that the people who look back on us in 100 years will not see a people in desperate times clutching to the word I. But they will know that we took up proudly the banner of a rich theology of we that will not be satisfied until this world is made more fair. You are invited to be maladjusted. And amen.